So there's these things you were probably taught in your high school graphic design class called the 5 design principles. If you're like me, then when you learn them, you didn't give a fuck about them. Well, now that I do what I do, I use these 5 design principles every day. And as I use them, I can see how other people aren't using them. Because these are basically the most fundamental thing in design, and in this case we're talking about web design, I think we should go back to the basics and talk about them, but in a lot more of an interesting way than the way I learned in high school. I'm going to use a mix of my drawings plus some real world examples of websites either doing each of the principles wrong or correctly. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll be able to identify the different types of design principles, and more importantly, how to use them to make your websites better. The 5 principles of design are balance, alignment, proximity, repetition, and contrast. You may have also been taught the acronym CRAP, which stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity, but this leaves out balance, and I think balance is pretty important, so the hell with CRAP. There are other lists of specific design principles like rhythm, white space, hierarchy, or scale, but all these other ones are just more specific examples of the 5 I have listed. Now, with these design principles, you'll be using some more often than others when designing a website, but all of them are important in their own way. All have the goal of trying to make your website design better, more usable, and more impactful. One interesting thing is that depending on how you use these design principles, this can affect both UI and UX. So how good your design looks and the experience users have with it. So this can subjectively and objectively impact how good your design is depending on how you use the design principles. Let's start off with the first principle, balance. Good balance is all about trying to create a visual harmony on your website, like trying to avoid one side of your website from having all the information when the other side has almost nothing. Balance can be measured symmetrically, asymmetrically, and radially. Here's an example of a wireframe of a design having good balance, particularly asymmetrically. So here's an image on the left, and on the right is a heading and a paragraph that together make both sides have an equal visual weight, so good balance. Here's a page design with bad balance. There's a heading and a button on the left, and on the right is an image with a lot of text. This creates a visual imbalance and ends up making it look a bit strange. The purpose of good balance in your website's design is for sections to be easier for users to scan the page and consume the content. And overall, just make your website look better. There's almost a subconscious effect going on when you can clearly tell the difference between a site with good balance or bad balance. Looking at some actual sites, here's Zoom's website. If we go down to their media section, they have this heading with the text button on the left and a lot of logos on the right. So in my opinion, the balance is a little off here, making the layout look a little awkward. And if you scroll down a little more, Zoom has a good example of balance, where there's 3 reviews in the left column and 3 awards in the right column. Here's an example of what I think is some bad balance going on. You can see in this testimonials section, there's a small logo on the left with a big quote on the right. This section looks a little off at a first glance. Now, these small examples of bad balance aren't going to make or break your design, but when you can see when balance can be improved, you're going towards a better website design. And here's the most interesting example of balance I've ever seen. This website has a 2-column layout with a large image on the right and only a little bit of text in the left column. But because this image is simple, with the majority of it being sky, both sides balance each other out with the visual weight that's going on. I think this image perfectly describes balance, and it's probably what the designer had going on in his head when he made this. However, one thing to know is that when it comes to balance is that certain designs can be objectively or subjectively better or worse. So there are some designs out there that can clearly have bad balance going on, but in other cases it looks completely okay in a subjective way, which again is completely okay. You just need to figure out when there's too much imbalance going on in your design to make it as good as you can. Next up is alignment. Alignment is all about how elements are placed on your website. The most obvious use of alignment is with text alignment, making it left, center, right, or justified. I did a video on text alignment, which you can check out if you want, link in the description. But alignment is more than just about text. Alignment can also be used to add interest into your design. Designers use alignment to add creativity to their designs like this. Here's a site that used alignment to better place these images in a more interesting layout than a typical 4-column grid. And they did this a little further down as well. Here's an example of some strange alignment. This is the text list of all their clients, but there isn't much going on for alignment here. Because of the way they did it, it's harder to read and consume the content, and honestly, it hurts my brain to look at. Here's what it looks like with all the text left aligned. It's not a good use of space, but because of the better alignment in this example, it's now a lot easier to read and for users to scan. Here's another great example of alignment. This website uses it to create a very interesting layout by aligning decorational images all around. They use alignment wonderfully here because the text content, arguably the most important part of the page, is aligned in a very clean, unobstructed way, in the middle in a center column. If they put the paragraphs around the page, like where they have these paint decorations, the readability of the site would suffer and it would hurt the user experience. So it's good that they used alignment with these added decorations, but didn't use alignment when messing around with the actual important content of the site. Overall, with alignment, you'll want to stick to using it uncreatively with important text content. If your plan is to add some design flavor to your paragraph content, make sure that flavor is vanilla. Alignment is much better put to creative use with decorative elements on your website. Alright, now for proximity. Proximity is all about how close elements are to other elements. The primary use of proximity is for creating relationships between elements. Like objects go together and distantly related objects are further away from each other. Proximity is also the design principle people are really referring to when they speak about white space in your design. So proximity, like white space, helps your elements breathe and make sections distinct from one another. Bad proximity can have negative effects on your website. You can see in this example, proximity wasn't thought about too much here, where these headings don't have relationships with the respective paragraphs underneath. If they wanted to improve the design, they would use proximity, or specifically margin in this case, on the headings so that the paragraph cohesion makes more intuitive sense, like this. And now you can see the content is a lot more readable, intuitive, and organized, all because of proximity. But here's a good example of proximity going on. Here's columns of different companies. It's very easy to tell what content goes with what company because of the good proximity with the elements to each other. Elements that are connected ideas are grouped together. And that's it for proximity. And now for repetition. So repetition is all about the consistency and the unity of your design in trying to create a cohesion between all the elements, and rarely using repetition to create an impact. Repetition is probably the most used and naturally intuitive design principle. Extremely unlikely a website doesn't even have the modest amount of repetition going on. The biggest and most obvious example of repetition is with your typography. Think about it. Every paragraph is designed the same. Every H1, well, should look like every other H1, and every H2 should look like every other H2, and so on. This ends up creating that cohesion I was talking about, but also a brand, style, consistency, a better user experience, and of course, repetition. Repetition should be consistent throughout a website's typography, sets of buttons, stylings, spacings, and very importantly, header and footer. Here's an example of some bad repetition going on. Here's a 4-page web portfolio of a UX designer, ironic I know, where his subpages have some awesome title sections for his about and contact page, but on his projects page he decides to make it unique. If he wanted to improve the repetition of his website, he would use the same title section for the projects page as he did the other ones. As I mentioned before, repetition can also be used to create impact. This is more common with graphic design rather than web design, but you can see an example of how they repeated their logo here. Overall, repetition is very important. It should basically be used overwhelmingly throughout any website. When you vary too many different sizes, shapes, and colors, it can be harder for the user to process and take it in. And lastly, contrast. Contrast is all about the difference or importance of other things versus other things on a website. One of the most prominent examples of contrast is again with typography. A website's typography usually has visually distinct styles for all the different types of HTML headings and paragraph text. The difference in contrast between these headings and paragraphs make for a very intuitive hierarchy, making it very easy for users to consume and understand the text content. Contrast is found in a lot of places, like the color of this text versus the background. The contrast is what actually makes the text readable against the animated background. A lot of people make this mistake, which I mentioned in my 50 web design mistakes video if you want to check it out. As you can see here, not everyone understands the importance of contrast. Contrast is important in web design because the reality is everything has a different level of importance, and not everything on a web page is important. And contrast allows you to tell users what to look at, what to value, and what's worth their time looking at. And that's contrast, which concludes all the 5 principles. When it comes to the 5 design principles, I find that every website usually hits at least 1 or 2 of these really well, but they fall short on one of them. A great website uses the design principles effectively to create the best possible user experience and great looking designs. Thank you for watching. If you want to be a better web designer or developer, check out my other videos.